Hi, Pastor Anthony here. Welcome to another episode of Sermon Snacks. This will be a little bit of a shorter episode today. I just wanted to look at one portion of the text that I preached on. Of course, we're talking about the text from Ecclesiastes 4, 7 through 16, which is that text that is based on the theme of community, about how two are better than one. And we saw that played out in the sermon with my emphasis on the various ways that played out in the text. But you may have well noticed that I left an entire portion of that text out when I preached it, and that's verses 13 through 16. Those verses read as follows: "Better is a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king, who will no longer take advice. One can indeed come out of prison to reign, even though born poor in the kingdom. I saw all the living who, moving about under the sun, follow that youth who replaced the king. There was no end to all those people whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a chasing after wind." Now, I just read that text to you. Do you understand that text? I find the translation in the New Revised Standard Version that I just read to you from in verses 13 through 16 of chapter 4 very clunky. Now, some of that is to be attributed to perhaps the translators, and some of it is attributable to the ambiguity around this text. There's a lot of ambiguity, which is one of the reasons I chose not to wade into the treacherous waters of verses 13 through 16 in my sermon. And this goes to one of the things about preaching. When you preach, you want to have a thematic thrust to your sermon, a unity to it. You don't want to go off on a tangent, on the rabbit trails that some preachers are guilty of. And if I were to wade into these verses, to try to get back out of that dense forest would have taken too long. It would have taken us off course. And so what I want to do in this time is to kind of think about that text. What is it really saying? First of all, can we even figure out what it's saying? And then why might it be here right next to? It comes right after the verse about the threefold cord is not quickly broken. It comes right on the heels, right after the main part of my message about two being better than one. Why is this stuck here? It's clearly part of this passage, this pericope, this preaching text. Chapter 5 clearly starts a new one, a new section. So why is this tucked here? Does it have any relationship whatsoever with what came before? And by the way, what does it mean? What's the teaching of this text? What is it even saying? And that's hard to pick up on from the text itself. As I mentioned, there's a lot of ambiguity. One of them is the he in verse 14. And this really goes to the amount of characters in the story and kind of the disjointed nature of the text. So some have wondered if the he, now in the New Revised Standard Version, there's no he there because of the gender inclusivity. So it reads, verse 14, "One can indeed come out of prison to reign, even though born poor in the kingdom." Now, in the New International Version, the older, it's rendered this way: "The youth may have come from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom." The he there, or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. Is that the young one, the young wise youth, or is this the old foolish king? It's hard to tell. The structure there is difficult. And this leads to another problem, as how many characters are here? You think you have a parable here of the wise youth and the foolish old king, two characters, but there are scholars, because of the ambiguities, the redundancies, the repetition, the weird connections here in this text, argue that there are three characters. Some actually argue that there are four characters here, kind of a series of successive kings who are being referred to in this text. And it goes to the question of, it's really hard to figure out what the text is saying. Let me read another translation of the same text. This is out of the Robert Alter's magnificent translation of the Old Testament. He writes this: "Better a poor but wise boy than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to be wary." So we get that, right? That's the easiest part, those two characters, the wise youth and the old foolish king. He goes on. For from the prison house he came out to be king, for in his kingship too the impoverished man was born. I don't know. He goes on, I have seen all the living who go about under the sun alongside the next boy. Here's another character who will stand in his place. Character number 3. There is no end to all the people, to all before whom he stood. Who's the he? Nor would the ones who came later be happy with him. Who are these people? For this too is mere breath and hurting the wind. So you see how disjointed, how confusing that text is. So what are we to make of it? Well, let me take a stab at it the best I can here. First, I think there's clearly here a set of contrasts being made that we can easily identify and that help to get us to part of the core of the message of this text, what it's trying to tell us. Because what we have here are 3 contrasts, right? We have a contrast, at least when it comes to these 2 main characters. We have a contrast between their age. One is a youth, one is an old king. So we have youth versus old, okay? Contrast number 1. The second contrast is to the extent of their knowledge or their reverence and use of wisdom. Because the youth is wise and the old guy is foolish. Okay, so we have a contrast there, contrast with age, contrast between their being wise and foolish, their knowledge, if we might want to use that word, not the best word because there's a distinction between the two, but you get the picture. And then thirdly, there's a contrast between their wealth. This is somewhat implied, but I think it's there, that the youth is impoverished, is poor, that's clear, and that the king is likely wealthy. We can assume that by his office, okay? So the contrast being made. Now, how this helps us to see a little bit of the rhetorical use of this, and the point it's trying to make is that there is here a reversal of expectations in the ancient Near East, and to some extent this is true today as well. If you read this story and you knew that there was an old rich person and that there was a poor young person, the clear kind of winner in this battle would be the old rich person. There would be a clear preference for older people being revered and wealthier people being revered, and poor people and young people being a little bit in the second class status. So what happens in the text, though, is there's a reversal of those kind of social expectations, and that's what gives it its poignancy and its teaching power, because it is the youth who ends up triumphant over the elderly one. The poor youth prevails over the old rich guy, okay, in the story. And then we think about, well, what is the catalyst? What is the thing that makes that change, makes this kind of one who should be disadvantaged, what allows him to prevail over one who is usually deemed the advantaged one? And it is, of course, wisdom and the willingness to heed wisdom, right? The old king no longer knows how to heed a warning, it says in the NIV. In the New Revised Standard Version, the old foolish king who will no longer take advice. So the old king is a fool who won't take advice, who won't heed warnings. The young poor guy is wise. And so the difference, the deal breaker, the kind of the factor that makes the difference is wisdom. And so what we have here being taught is the prize of wisdom, the exaltation of wisdom. Wisdom is the thing you should long for and have. It's the most important thing, more important than age, more important than wealth. But that doesn't really give us a full picture of what this text is telling us about, what its purpose, what its meaning is. Why is it here? That's a harder thing to get at. Okay, so certainly exaltation of wisdom, but why is it connected to a passage that tells us about the importance of community, that two are better than one? Well, that's a great question. I have an answer. I'm not sure how satisfying it will be, but let's think about the story here, the fullness of the story. What I think we have here from a plot perspective is that there is a foolish old king who is supplanted by a poor, wise youth What creates that supplanting is the wisdom that the youth possesses versus the foolishness of the old king. And then this young king goes viral, if you will. He becomes very popular, and there are crowds before him. And this is in the text of verse 15. I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth. Okay, the king's successor. So he's very popular. Verse 15 in the New Revised Standard Version, I saw all the living who, moving about under the sun, follow that youth who replaced the king. So there's a sense of popularity. He's a very popular person. In the Alter's translation, I have seen all the living who go about under the sun alongside the next boy who will stand in his place. So this kind of there is no end to all the people, to all before whom he stood. So there's this sense of crowd, right? Popularity and succession. But what happens in the story is that the popularity of this young, wise king also fades, and he too is supplanted. I do think there are multiple characters here beyond them, that there is a line of succession. Let me kind of try to get at this by, here's Robert Alter's kind of summary about this very difficult text to try to get the meaning out of it. He writes this in the notes to his translation. He writes this: many futile attempts have been made to anchor this exemplary tale in the succession of two or more particular historical monarchs. So there has been some people who have tried to connect this to particular people in the history of the Old Testament, particular monarchs and rulers. He rejects that idea. He says, but it seems more sensible to understand it as another illustrative instance of the pattern of futility from one generation to the next. This idea of succession, right? In this case, in regard to the exercise of power, kingship. He goes on, some of the details remain obscure, indeed, but the following narrative outline is likely. Okay, so here he gives you the story. Here's what he thinks is going on here. A clever boy, a young man, is preferable to a doddering old king, perhaps senile, and not able to look out for his own interests. The boy, once imprisoned, perhaps for debt, and powerless, so he's poor right there, somehow managed to get out and assume the throne. Okay, great story, right? He wins the day, the underdog. But it goes on, Alter writes, he in turn is succeeded by a third figure like himself. In this chain of succession, no one gets lasting benefit from the exercise of power. So perhaps, as Alter's suggesting, that the meaning of this is the futility of generations, the futility of even the labor of a king. You're just going to be succeeded by another. All is vanity, chasing after the wind. Now, that may well be true, and certainly I think you hear it in there because of how it ends, how the text ends in verse 16. The last sentence is, this too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. So there is something here to popularity, right? And how that too fades. Another successor comes, another generation, another king comes to the throne, and you lose your popularity, you become a nobody, and someone succeeds you. It's meaningless, it's futility. So is that the whole idea here? Is that why it's here? Well, I think that's there. I think there's the exaltation of wisdom, which I mentioned in the contrast. That's the differentiating factor. I think there is something here to the futility of generations in kingship and in power, that too ultimately comes to nothing. But that doesn't really tell us, well, why is it here in a chapter, in a section, in a pericope, where you have this idea of the importance of community, the threefold cord, the two being better than one, this thing that kind of emphasizes the benefits of community over living a solitary or individual existence, that we need one another. It still doesn't answer that question. So do I have an answer? Well, I think Richard Belcher offers an interesting answer to that, an interesting possibility to interpreting this in a way that puts it within the meaning of the text. This is what he says here in his commentary on page 185. The story begins with a better than saying, showing the benefits of wisdom, okay? But in the long run, he goes on, the benefit of wisdom is relative because it cannot produce anything lasting. All right, so that's with that whole generation, succession, all that kind of stuff. Through wisdom, a poor youth comes to the throne, but he cannot maintain his position of power. That's kind of along with what Alter says. It's fleeting, it's chasing after the wind. But then he writes this at the end of his remarks here. He says, one might draw the conclusion that there is safety in numbers. That goes back to the two are better than one, right? Part of that was about safety, protection out in the wilderness of the ancient Near East. But he goes on here. But chapter 4, verses 13 through 16 shows that this is not the right conclusion to draw because numbers do not ensure stability. The multitudes may not recognize wisdom and may easily change their allegiance. What is he saying there? He's saying, by the way, first of all, he says the connection of the story with the context here is not obvious. Yes, understatement of the year. But I think what he's getting at here at this end point is, let's consider this as a counterweight, a counterbalance to the main point of the text. The main point of the text is what? The solitary life is bad. There is protection in numbers. There's benefits to being in community. There's benefits to having a lot of people around you and being part of that. But here at the end in this last story, what Belcher is suggesting is, well, that popularity and power in numbers can also be fleeting. There's another side to it. There's a kind of a balance here. As he says here, one might draw the conclusion that there is safety in numbers. And it shows that this is not the right conclusion to draw because numbers do not ensure stability. And so here this king, right, had a lot of people. He went viral. He had a lot of followers. He had this huge community. People loved him. But yet what happened? He lost all of that popularity. He lost all of that thing. So sometimes community can be a negative thing, a dangerous thing. And so maybe the teacher here is teaching us about the dangers of wanting to be too popular. Two may be better than one, but perhaps too many are seeking the adoration of crowds is not a way of living a meaningful life. And this would be a very appropriate thing to talk about. Here I am on YouTube, right? And, I notice the views on my videos, modest as they are. But we live in this entire culture that wants to be liked. I mean, not just liked personally, but liked. They want their video liked. Give me a thumbs up and like my video. And you hear it at every kind of video you hear. Like and subscribe, and that kind of stuff. And on a Facebook, having followers to your Twitter account. So here perhaps is a warning that type of popularity, that type of numbers, that type of community is perhaps a fleeting thing, something that you shouldn't place your trust in, and maybe the teacher of wisdom is trying to instruct us in that lesson. So as he emphasizes the importance of community, that the solitary life is not a good life, it's better to have two than one, that he also provides wisdom in saying, but the type of popularity that is superficial or driven because of your position of power or seeking after fame, that is vanity, that's chasing after the wind. Don't do that. It's ultimately fleeting, it's not worthwhile. And boy, isn't that a good lesson for us today in the culture in which we live that is so draws so much meaning from simple sense of this kind of superficial popularity. What you want is a real close engagement in a community. And that's one of the great things the church can offer and friendship can offer. And even in the marriage context, you can experience. But that's the type of community we want, not necessarily one that is superficial or based on our fame or position of power that we can demand just because of who we are, the office that we hold. So that's my best effort. That's my sermon snack for the day. I hope that makes it a little bit clearer, although that is very much an unclear text, as I think that Belcher says, well, the connection of the story with the context is not obvious. Indeed, it is not obvious, but I hope I've done something to help clear that up a little bit. Clear as mud, but it covers the ground, so to speak. Thanks for tuning in, and I really appreciate your engagement and digging a little deeper into the text here in Ecclesiastes. God bless you. Have a great day.